All right, so next we're going to get into start getting into the nuts and bolts of government and how different governments are structured throughout the world. So these are conversations that take really, really long time in class. So I'm going to try not to be too rambly, but also try to give you some important context around what we're talking about. Um, all right, so the countries that we talk about in this course have a really, really, really interesting and different way in which they allocate political power. So I usually start by having us talk and think about the United States because it's what we know and it's what we sort of think of and contextualize, how we contextualize sort of the separation of powers that exists within countries. And then I use that as sort of examples for other countries and ways to think about and describe how power is distributed differently within other countries. Separation of powers refers to a system of governments in which government power is divided into several bodies with the ability to check the power of the other. So, essentially, we are pretty used to and learned about probably in middle school, hopefully sometime, the different branches of government: legislative, executive, judicial. And sort of the governmental organs that exist in each, right? In the United States, we have the House of Representatives and the Senate that consists of our legislative branch. We have the president and the vice president and their cabinet, essentially, and sort of all of the departments that make up the executive branch of government. And then the judicial branch, the highest court in the land is the Supreme Court, and we have a system of federal and state courts that exist beneath the Supreme Court. And we all know and can think of the different ways in which these branches can essentially check other branches, right? The judicial branch can rule that laws or executive orders are unconstitutional. Um, the executive branch can veto laws that the legislative branch passes. The legislative branch can override that veto. Um, all the different ways in which these essentially check the others, right? So there's some interesting. So I would say, in just a broadly speaking way, Mexico and Nigeria have governments that are structured this way. So they are going to be the most easy to wrap your head around, I think, because they are the most structured like the American government. But when we get into parliamentary systems like the UK, when we get into semi-presidential systems that just like Russia that just have different structures in different ways in which the branches of government sort of interact with each other, that's when things get a little bit confusing. And then things get real confusing when we get to Iran. And then China's kind of out there in an interesting, different way, because the Communist Party has so much political power, and essentially, oftentimes you have party party bodies or different kind of party institutions that serve and sort of serve as a check on state institutions that are parallel. So there's interesting ways in which power kind of flows within China too. All right. So a second term on this is called fusion of powers, and we see this within the UK, a system of governance in which all or most of the authority is concentrated in one body. So this is going to be a term that we use a lot when we get to the UK. But you could also maybe think about it when you get to some of the authoritarian regimes too, because it might apply there too. And again, this is just another way to show the U.S. system because I think it's the easiest for us to think about. You have the executive branch here in the middle, the president, the vice president, all of the things that flow from the executive branch. You have the legislative branch, the Congress, the Senate, the House of Representatives, and then you have the judicial branch. And most of our states are structured this way, all of our states are structured in this way, and then the federal government is structured this way as well. All right, so let's think about kind of the three branches individually and what sort of exists within them. So first, we're going to talk about the executive branch. So the executive branch carries out the laws and policies of the state. So when we think of the executive branch in the United States, we often think of the president, right, and who is the chief executive of the executive branch. So it looks different in different countries, because in the United States, the president is both the head of state and the head of government. They are essentially the person that's in charge of running the government to some extent, and they also are the head of state. They symbolize and represent the United States to the rest of the world, and they have widespread powers over foreign policy. they have a lot of different kind of powers that in some countries are actually split between two people. So in the United States, the head of state and the head of government is kind of ingrained or combined into the presidential position. And we see the same thing in Mexico. We see the same thing in Nigeria. But there's actually other ways in which, interesting ways in which these two kind of terms can be split up. So the term head of state symbolizes and represents the people, may or may not have policymaking power. So a really interesting head of state that exists within the AP6 is Queen Elizabeth II in the UK, who essentially is a symbol of the British crown and a symbol of sort of the traditional legitimacy that exists within the country, but doesn't actually have any sort of policymaking power, and intentionally is set up to not have any sort of policymaking power. But it is really interesting to see, like, when things are done in the UK system, there's always some sort of deference or some sort of symbolic interaction with the crown itself to confer some of her legitimacy onto the rest of the operation. And there's other interesting examples of different heads of state. The Ayatollah in Iran. You have kind of a divvying up of positions within Russia, where Vladimir Putin is the president and the head of state. And because of the semi-presidential system itself, you actually have a different person that sort of works under him. But it gets weird with Russia a little bit. So just know that sometimes you might have it split up like the UK's, where you have a head of state that doesn't actually have that much policymaking power, and a head of government, who in this case would be the Prime Minister Boris Johnson at the present, who's actually in charge of running the country and in charge of running the government itself. And then a third term is the chief executive. So I would say in the UK system, Boris Johnson would be both the head of government and the chief executive, because he is the most important person in the policymaking apparatus that exists. All right, so executive office, the executive branch kind of consists of that, as well as a cabinet that oftentimes works underneath or side by side with the president or with the prime minister or with whoever the chief executive is, in terms of carrying out these decisions that are made. All right, so brief overview of executive branch. Now we're going to talk about legislative branches. So legislative branches, for kind of what we need to know right now, they are the branch that makes laws. So we're going to go pretty light on that right now. We'll talk a lot about it when we get to each individual countries. So one thing I want to alert you to is the different structure in which legislatures take form within the AP6. So you have 4 of the countries that actually have a bicameral legislative system. So bicameral refers to when there are 2 separate bodies that make up essentially the legislative branch. So like the United States in its House of Representatives and its Senate, you have that in 4 of the 6 countries. But things get weird. Nothing's ever simple here. So Nigeria and Mexico actually have a system that's relatively close to the United States. They have a Senate. They have a lower house, which in Mexico is called the Chamber of Deputies. In Nigeria, it's called the House of Representatives, conveniently. So you have essentially a system that has a lot of the same organizational structure as the United States. The UK has a really interesting system in which one of the two legislative bodies, the House of Lords, is almost entirely powerless and symbolic and does nothing. Whereas the other, the House of Commons, does pretty much everything important in the entire country. So that is part of the parliamentary system, and we are going to spend a whole lot of time talking about that. And then Russia has a pretty interesting setup where you have a lower house called the Duma that does a whole lot of the same as the House of Commons. Essentially, it is the policy-making apparatus. But then you have something called the Federation Council, which is also a part of their legislature and actually has an interesting role in terms of the federal nature of Russia's government, which we'll talk about that term. Does a lot of the interesting things related to its sort of the different structure, a way in which power is distributed throughout the country. So oftentimes within bicameral systems, you will see the upper house and the lower house will have different jobs to do, just like in the United States. And the US actually has a relatively unique system for a lot of reasons. So we'll get into that conversation at some point once we get into class a little bit, I'm sure. And two countries within the AP6, China and Iran, have a unicameral legislative branch. Essentially, they have only one house. So in Iran, that is called the Majlis, and they are basically one of the governmental institutions within the country that's directly elected by the people. And in China, that is called I forget what it's called in China. We'll talk about that later. It's weirdly not as important as one would think it would be. Um, so we will get to that when we get to China.